Well, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and have the opportunity to speak to this group. And it seems like everywhere I go across the country, these crowds just keep getting larger and larger and larger as the interest in this crop continues to grow. I'm originally from the state of Kentucky. Our family farm there way back in the day had hemp. So it's been kind of an interesting ride these past couple of years to see how this crop has been reintroduced within the state. And I'm going to talk most specifically about Kentucky a little bit, but I'll throw in a lot of things from different states around the country, and we can talk a little bit about that in questions and answers later on. So when I look back at Kentucky, and I've been really involved with this, with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture since 2014, we started that first year with 32 acres of hemp that got in finally. I think we finally got the seed, got the DEA out of the way, and finally got some seeds planted in July. We didn't harvest a single acre of that, but we had hemp growing. So that was a big piece in the state. And we went on fast forwarding through 2015, 2016, we saw a little bit of growth. Most of that period was fiber and grain. But in 16, 17, 18, we saw a huge explosion in the number of acres in Kentucky related to CBD production or cannabidiol production, essential oils, however you want to phrase that terminology. And then in 2019, we ended up with about 60,000 licensed acres. Roughly 22, 23, 24,000 of that was planted, and we're going to have about 20,000 harvested. So we've had this enormous explosion that's put a lot of pressure on our Kentucky Department of Agriculture. It's put a lot of pressure on the research side to try and get caught up to where a lot of the farmers are at, because in a lot of cases they're out in front of us as researchers. But we've had a big change within the state. Keep in mind, though, this is still a pretty small number relative to some of the acres of a lot of other crops in the state. So it's still, we still haven't got there in terms of value yet. This right here is kind of a proliferation of where hemp acres have come from within the country from 2015 to 2019. This is based on FSA data. I will say that this is incomplete. There are a lot of missing pieces to this, but USD or FSA, the 578 form, is about one of the only forms that's collecting any type of this information across the country. So, but you can see that it's exploded, and we've got 47, almost 50 states that are going to be in the game in 2020. And in 2020, they're also supposed to have to report all of these acres. So I'm curious to see how this really fills out when we get to that. Now, keep in mind, this is all types of hemp. You can break this down into oils and into grain and fiber specifically. Okay. Oftentimes, when I get to a lot of talks, especially to producers, so we just had in December our Kentucky Hemp Summit, which is kind of our kickoff meeting for the 2020 growing season. There were 1,200 producers there and processors. So it was a huge room full of tons of people talking about this. And we oftentimes forget about the economics and what role it plays. All we think about is some of the media outlets that we've seen and what happens there. And then I kind of get this look from people, and they tell me, oh, it's not possible that prices can be going down. I keep hearing that, but we've got a tremendous amount of supply coming on the market, and we can talk about that in terms of pricing and maybe where I think we're going in that. So I pulled together some pricing and budgets and stuff that we're using for 2020. And if you look back at Panex Exchange, this is one source of data that's trying to collect prices for biomass. This is biomass prices. On the y-axis, you'll see dollars per percent CBD or dollars per point. And you kind of see that early 2019 prices were up there around $4, and then we fast forward all the way to the end of 2019, you're all the way down at $1 or maybe less. Okay, so as you went from maybe $40 an acre if you're at 10% CBD all the way down to $4 or $5 or $10. So depending upon where you're at in terms of CBD production. And this is for Kentucky, Oregon, Colorado, and this is exactly what I'm seeing in the state of Kentucky. I pulled it more specifically to the state of Kentucky, okay? And Originally, when I built my budgets for 2019, I had it built on $5.06% CBD, so $30 a pound. Okay, and you'll see that we spiked above that in July, and then ever since we've basically been coming down. And I think this is reminiscent of what you're going to see in a lot of other crops. You know, at harvest, you get that downward pressure on prices fall, but I think there's an additional piece that's going on in this. One of the things that I think is also going on is the lack of processing capacity in the U.S. to handle the amount of crop that we have come along. And a lot of that is a function, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few, but venture capital's kind of gone out of the market in some places, and they haven't had the money that they thought they were going to have to expand processing capacity. So processors are basically telling the producers to hold on to this crop, and you may have to hold on to it for 6 months, 12 months, and that's something I think a lot of producers and processors failed to ever think about when they put this crop in the ground. If we look at our budgets, and this is some preliminary stuff that we're getting ready to roll out for 2020. You'll see I've got CBD percentage in here at 6%. You're going to tell me that that's probably a little low, maybe, but I work off about a 25-to-1 ratio. Okay, so 25 parts per one. So total THC of 0.3% gives you somewhere between 6 and 8% CBD. That's kind of the magic number that I'm working off of. You're going to see some varieties out there. They talk about a much higher ratio than that, but from what I'm gathering from my agronomic friends in that space, they think that that's about the ratio where we're at now. I think with plant genetics and as we go along in the future, we're going to change that ratio with our breeding programs. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm telling our producers that they need to think about $1.50 or less per point, and that's scaring them to death because trying to get down to that level. And I think our last presenter is going to talk some about Canada, and I think they're out in front of us in terms of thinking about this in a broad acre sense and trying to mechanize this crop to get down to that $1.50, maybe even less on a per point basis. So you can also tell in here we're looking at plants per acre. These are the two different models that we're seeing in Kentucky, a tobacco model and a plasticulture model. I'm guessing here in the state of Wisconsin, you're primarily on a plasticulture type system since you have a lot of vegetable production. But in Kentucky, we're definitely on a tobacco type model, not dealing with the plastic and some of those pieces. But so that's kind of what I'm looking at. I'm showing some positive returns here, not the $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 numbers that I've seen reported in the media. It's just not there. Maybe if you rewind back to that 16, 17, 18 time frame, maybe. And there were some farms that got some of those types of returns. But there are also some farms, especially within the state of Kentucky, that waited for 2 years to get that check. So specifically, I can think of one or two that waited 2 years to get a $4.5 million check. How many farms do you know that can finance $4.5 million for 2 years to wait on that? That becomes a really big point to think about. Okay. But there is some positive potential out there for that. I don't have anything in here on fiber and grain. They're pretty much break even at best in terms of what I'm looking at in terms of returns over total cost. I also put in here some sensitivity analysis. So if we do think about that $1, and then you think about 6 to 8% CBD, I'm really showing a lot of negative numbers. So we got to get back up over that dollar to that $1.50 type range to start seeing some positive numbers show back up in that. So that's something, if you're a producer or processor, you really need to think about what's going to happen. Now it's going to be interesting to see. We have a number of states who are going to operate under the 2014 pilot program, and how that's going to change some of this landscape a little bit by state. And I still haven't totally figured out all those pieces going forward and what impacts that's going to have. The plasticulture is a little bit better just because of lower plant costs. I think one of the other big things in this that's driving a lot of these costs is going to be plant cost. And when we go to a total THC model, I think we're going to have a lack of seed availability because you get a lot of the western states and a lot of this recreational and medical marijuana states that were producing CBD varieties that are higher, and they were only dealing with Delta 9 states. and a lot of those varieties were bred for those types of states. So Tennessee would be an example of that, Colorado, a few of those others are states that operate on a different THC testing system. So once we get the final interim rules, all that sorted out, and see what that actual THC level is going to be, it's going to be a telltale story. But I think seed prices and clone prices are going to continue to be a huge factor in terms of profitability, and they're going to be pretty expensive going forward. I know I've been in a number of other states, and they're like, well, we're not going to have our program out until March of 2020. In March of 2020, if you're just hunting for seed, you've missed the boat. Good luck finding quality seed or clones in that space. I did put in here where I would like to go and where I think we can go. And these are two different models that are being tried out in Kentucky. One is CBD row crop harvested with grain, so basically running a combine through it. You're collecting the chaff out of the backside of the combine, that's your CBD, and you're collecting the seed out of the head of it. Now, granted, you're going to have a lower CBD content, but you can grow this on a much larger scale. This example right here, actually in the bottom, is you could actually potentially harvest all three. You could harvest the seed, the chaff, and the fiber out of this model, but and is one way you could possibly go and think about that. But that's not really where we're thinking about yet. Eventually, we would like to get there. But looking at just returns over variable costs, it's pretty interesting at this level. Now, we're going to have soon out this with fixed costs added in too, so you can get returns over all costs. That's going to come down a little bit more on a per acre basis. The other one is a silage, basically a silage model. So Wisconsin ought to be pretty familiar with silage production. Ought to be an easy one to get into, but can we actually ensile it and store it that way and then process it? And that's one method we're actually looking at as well in Kentucky and trying to figure out where we can go with that. It could potentially have a little bit higher CBD content. Depends upon that fermentation process within the ensiling, or if you're actually going to completely ensile it, or you're going to try and dry it right off the bat. We have one company in the state of Kentucky that's basically harvesting with a silage chopper at 70% moisture and trying to dry it to 10 and then extract. So I'm struggling with the costs on that side to get to something that is going to be economically viable. So I'm going to try and maybe tell some stories now and a few things that have happened. So this is kind of the good, bad, and the ugly of the hemp industry, especially. This is not only Kentucky, this is across the country. We've had some amazing things come out. There was an article last year, maybe my sense of humor is a little twisted here, and I will apologize for that. We had the Wall Street Journal come out with something like $75,000 an acre. That was a Wall Street Journal publication. Christopher Wolf, you're familiar with him at the Dairy Expo. This past year, he actually had somebody stand up in his session and say, I'll guarantee profits to any dairy farmer. Anybody be happy about that? Yeah. And one of my favorite little memes is I've got 99 problems in CBD oil, solved like 86 of them. The one thing that I tell you CBD oil can't solve is the fundamentals of economics. Okay? It just doesn't work. Okay? So those are some, I guess, some good things. And I am really positive on this industry. And, you know, you talked about a lot earlier about all the food manufacturing. If CBD does have the properties it says it does, FDA puts all that through, you have the food processing here to add that in. That is a huge competitive advantage for you all. In the state of Kentucky, I'm really interested in the fiber side of things. We have a lot of automotive manufacturing and some other high-end manufacturing products. And as the state of Kentucky, we're known for growing biomass. So let's capitalize on that. So I think there are some really exciting things. It's just going to take some time. And this industry is going through a ton of growing pains. Maybe some of the bad, one of the big misconceptions that came out early on is, oh, this plant doesn't need any water, really. Doesn't need fertilize, be grown on marginal land, there's no diseases, there's no pests. It is perfect. It is not. I hate to tell you that. There are diseases, there are pests. It does not grow well on marginal land. We've tried it in Kentucky. They're like, oh, we'll put it on the reclaimed mine land. Well, you put a crop on a marginal, you get marginal results out of marginal land, okay? And that's true with about any crop that you talk about. These are things that keep continuing to come, and these are going to be symptoms of this growing, of the growing pains in this industry. There's going to be things like people getting sued. So there's a Kentucky firm suing an Oregon group for a big chunk of change because seeds. How many of you, if you're a farmer, got your seeds in a Ziploc baggie that showed up in the mail? You know, we've got farmers suing different hemp companies in the state of Kentucky. I saw a bankruptcy that just went through on Friday with another company in Kentucky. So they're coming, there's cash flow issues. One of the things that really scares me is a lot of producers bet the farm on this crop. I know I've had a number of calls in my office going, I quit my job, I liquidated my savings, I bought some land and I'm growing hemp. Okay, good luck. Now let's talk a little about that decision you just made and can you get your job back? Those types of conversations continue to happen. There's another lawsuit against some other companies that went out of business. I was in one building not too long ago and several thousand square feet, and I'm standing there and there's a 42-inch ceiling fan 30 feet in the air over top of about 60,000 square feet of space running. And I'm like, why are you running this here? You know, the business was bankrupt as it was, and they still had this type of funny things running. I've been in another one. They basically bought stock in NutriBullets, and that's how they were processing some of this. I mean, I can imagine that conversation when you rolled into Costco and said, I'll need a pallet of NutriBullets, right? And that's how I'm going to process my hemp. And that's what they were doing with it. The stories keep coming, and we can talk more about that, but there's going to be a lot of this come out, and it's going to be a fun case study, and one of these days when I look back on this and write some things, it's going to be a fascinating story to tell going forward. Okay. So going forward in 2020, we're going to have 40 plus states, 47, 50 states in the game. We've still got a lot of new regulations coming at the state and federal level. The hype machine, I think, is going to continue. I think it's almost on a weekly basis. I'm doing some sort of interview with somebody about this crop and what's going on in it. And the number of producers with little or no ag background, and I'm going to say this on both the producer side and the processor side, is really, really interesting. And it's creating some really interesting dynamics. Producers that don't have an ag background aren't familiar with how to deal with people with an ag background maybe, and that creates some friction. And then processors that come into this that have no ag background are dealing with producers in a very different way that producers aren't totally familiar with dealing and how to deal with that. So it's created a lot of conflict and some interesting scenarios. International markets, I get a fairly regularly, I get a call from an international market wanting to know how to get into this game in the U.S., and I think that's going to continue to go. Concentration, I think, is going to happen once we get more rules and standardization across the country. You're going to see some of the larger companies move into this space that actually have the capital to do the investment. Contracts are still completely up in the air. Some of the contracts I get are they're really interesting reads, and I wonder how in the world they ever got to the ideas that they got to, but we can talk about that later. But the contract space there's a lot to learn in that, and a lot of clarification going forward. Crop insurance, we've got 21 states and select counties that's coming out with that, but really no background on what that's going to entail yet. So we'll see how that plays out and where they're going to get some of their information. We're going to continue, I think, to have oversupply issues. Financing is going to continue to be a problem, and I think prices are going to continue at least as low as they are, if not push even lower going forward in 2020. So these are some of the things that I'm telling our producers to think about. How many acres can you actually effectively manage? I was talking in the state of Texas not too long ago, and everything I heard down there is they're all going to start with 1,000 acres. I know everything's bigger in Texas, but that doesn't make it right, okay? One of their other comments that I really enjoyed is it seems like every state I go to, they're going to be the king of hemp. Texas was no different. They said they're going to be the king of hemp, and my first comment was, there's just not enough crowns to go around. So, you know, every state is getting into this game, and every state thinks that they're going to be it. I think there are going to be pockets develop around the country within this crop. Producers, do you have a market? How much can I actually afford to invest? Financing, how am I going to finance that? You know, there was a mentioned earlier, 50% of the lending agencies are getting requests about hemp. Well, I mean, I've sat in some of those rooms with some of the 2 largest lending agents or lending companies in the U.S., and they're not lending on hemp. If you've got dirt, they'll lend on that. And you've got collateral, they'll lend on that, but they're not going to lend on the crop yet, okay? That's just not where they're going. And I don't know that they trust what's written in these contracts to even think about it at this point in time. Have you done your homework? Can you mitigate? And one thing that I think a lot of our producers in Kentucky are guilty of this, but they didn't think past plan A. What am I going to do with this? So I get a number of calls about where can I sell this at? Well, good luck. There's not really any other place to sell this right now. You're going to have to wait and see if this market clears and see if the processing can catch up, okay? On the processor side, it's a lot of the same, and I don't think a lot of the processors thought through what happens if my venture capital pulls out. I've seen this happen in multiple cases in the state of Kentucky. So they were almost at the precipice of having their plant built, and that venture capital pulled out, and now they're left hung with no money to pay farmers, no money to pay the people who are putting that equipment in, and it's resulting in some of these lawsuits that you're seeing. Who actually has the liability? So was the crop actually, the plants, were they provided to the process or to the producer at no cost, or did the producer actually pay for those? Because that spells the difference between who has the liability on some of the contract or on the crop insurance side of the game. Yeah, so there's a lot of fun stories we can continue to tell about this, and I'm more than happy to discuss at any point in time. This is the 3 of us at the University of Kentucky that are handling most all the questions, and primarily it's me and my research associate or farm management specialist, Jonathan Shepard. Feel free to reach out to us with questions, and we're always up for a good story. So, thank you.